Although I've only been Al-Anon a little over 11 years now, I'm somewhat of an anachronism in that I'm the only person still living that was present when the two co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous met for the first time at the home of Henrietta Seiberling in Akron, Ohio on Mother's Day in 1935. And my father is Dr. Bob, and my mother's Ann. And I rode out with my father and mother on that day. You see, my father had come home on the Saturday before Mother's Day with a potted plant, set it down. He was potted. He went on upstairs, went to bed as it was his custom, and Henrietta Seiberling was a friend of my mother's, and she called and said, "Ann, there's a man out here that thinks he can help Bob. Bring him right on out." Well, my mother had to explain to Henrietta that Bob was in no shape to see anybody, but being good Al-Anon material, she'd get him out there the next day. Well, he had a terrible hangover. And finally he said, "Okay, 15 minutes of this bird is all I want." But folks, when they got there, he and Bill went off in a room by themselves, and it wasn't 15 minutes. They stayed several hours. And as a result of that meeting, and at my mother's invitation, Bill came to live at our home there in Akron, Ohio, for all that summer, 3-month period of time. And this is the time and the place that Alcoholics Anonymous was first started. Now, it started in the middle of the last Great Depression in Akron. Was a one industry town. The rubber factories were all there: Goodyear, Goodrich, General, Firestone, Seiberling, Miller, and a bunch of others. Well, when people stopped buying automobiles, they stopped needing tires. And that town just fell flat on its face economically. There were strong men on the street corner selling apples for 5 cents a piece. There was repoed cars, just tier after tier, stored in the downtown garages. That's how tough the times were there. But maybe God provided that providentially because people had a lot of time on their hands, and they could be with each other. And I think that was so essential when this little movement was first starting. We lived in a very modest frame home there in Akron, and would have lost that if it hadn't been for the mortgage moratorium declared by President Roosevelt in 1933, whereby people like us who could no longer make the mortgage payments were allowed to stay in the home and not be thrown out in the street. That's how tough it was, because alcoholism and the times had reduced us to a state of absolute poverty. There was times when there was nothing to eat in that house except bread and milk, sometimes nothing but potato soup. We didn't starve, but it was a near thing. So it was a really unlikely start. Well, Bill moved in, and I'd like to describe my father to you. I think you'd have loved the man. He was a tall, thin Vermonter. He had icy blue eyes. He was a graduate of Dartmouth, one of the Ivy League colleges in the East, and the Drinkers Ivy League College. And he had worked in industry a couple of years and then had come back to St. Johnsbury, Vermont, his home, and prevailed upon his father, who was a probate judge up there, to allow him to go to medical school. And he came out to Chicago and barely managed to graduate from medical school because his alcoholism, like alcoholism is progressive. And somehow managed to obtain a coveted internship there at City Hospital in Akron. It was coveted because they had some new equipment there. Moved out to Akron and married my mother after a whirlwind courtship of only 17 years. Dr. Bob thought things over very carefully. Dr. Bob had a brilliant mind, a great sense of humor. He was a man's man. He as a young man, used to like to go out in the woods in Maine and Vermont and sustain himself off the land. He liked that sort of thing. Women felt comfortable around him because he was always courteous, and he so obviously loved my mother that they felt at home with him. He loved the slang of the day, and I'm not talking about the nasty four-letter words, but just the words that the young people like to use. Even though he had a marvelous vocabulary, he loved that kind of words, so anybody could talk to Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob had been a general practitioner there in Akron for a number of years, and then he decided he would go back to Rochester, Minnesota, and study under the Mayo brothers at Mayo Clinic, become a surgeon. Did nothing but surgery for the balance of his professional career. Well, Dr. Bob, like a lot of people I've noticed that drink, had tattoos. And of course they wore those short-sleeve surgical gowns, and one of Dr. Bob's was a dragon. And it started at his shoulder, and it went around and around. It came clear out to his wrist, and it was blue with red fire. And I said, Dad, how in the world did you get that? And he said, boy, that was a dandy. He had a beautiful sense of humor. When I brought Betty home to be my prospective bride back in the 40s, he looked her over, and as you see, Betty's tall and thin. He got me aside and said, she's built for speed and light housekeeping. Well, when Bill moved in, Bill was also a tall, thin Vermonter. And you'd have liked Bill, too, those of you who didn't get to know him. But he was the exact opposite of Dr. Bob. Bill was garrulous. Bill loved to talk. Bill was a promoter. Bill was a visionary. Bill Wilson could see further up the road than any human I've ever known. Bill's mood swung. He was either high as a Georgia pine or low as a snake. Yeah, he never seemed to level out. My father was the level one, and they fit together perfectly. And I think maybe God arranged that too, because folks, if any two of us are exactly alike, one of us is unnecessary. These two guys never had an argument. They seemed to fit together perfectly. And I think that was necessary, too. I've heard this said, perhaps you have, too, that if AA had been left up to Dr. Bob Smith, it would still be in Ohio. And if AA had been left up to Bill Wilson, he'd have sold it to a franchise.